What does it actually mean when a government pulls back from the edge 3 separate times, and then, without warning, does the exact thing everyone assumed it was avoiding? Because that's the pattern sitting at the center of this story, and it's a pattern most headlines completely fail to explain. 3 times, the United States appeared to step back from direct action against Iranian infrastructure. 3 times, officials signaled restraint, delay, diplomatic openings, reasons to wait, and then, with very little public warning, American forces struck infrastructure targets inside Iran directly. Not a symbolic gesture, not a limited, deniable action, a direct hit on the kind of target that changes the entire calculus of a conflict. So the real question isn't whether the strike happened. Everyone already knows it did. The real question is why the pattern of restraint came first, why it happened 3 separate times, and what that sequence actually tells you about how this decision was really made. Once you understand that pattern, you'll understand something most coverage of this story gets completely wrong. Before we go any further, if you want to actually understand the strategy behind decisions like this instead of just reacting to headlines as they happen, hit subscribe right now. This channel breaks down exactly how moments like this get built step by step, long before the public ever sees the outcome. And this one is one of the most revealing examples you'll find this year. Let's start with the 3 moments of restraint, because each one matters, and each one was read completely differently at the time than it looks in hindsight. The first moment came early, when tensions were already rising, and there was real pressure, both from allies and from hawkish voices inside Washington, to respond immediately and forcefully to provocations coming out of Iran. At that point, the administration held back. Officials pointed to diplomatic channels still technically open, to allies who weren't yet aligned on the scope of any response, to intelligence assessments that reportedly weren't yet conclusive enough to justify a strike of that magnitude. At the time, that restraint was interpreted by a lot of observers as hesitation, maybe even as a sign the administration wasn't fully prepared to follow through on its own rhetoric. Critics on one side called it weakness. Supporters on the other side called it patience. Almost nobody at that point read it as part of a longer, deliberate sequence. The second moment came later, after conditions on the ground had shifted further, after Iranian-aligned forces had escalated activity in ways that, in an earlier era, might have triggered a much faster response. Again, the administration held back publicly, even while reportedly authorizing smaller, less visible actions behind the scenes. Officials framed the pause as giving room for regional partners to manage the situation directly, avoiding the appearance of the United States, acting unilaterally in a way that could fracture the coalition it had spent months building. Again, this was read by many as continued hesitation, maybe even drift, a sign that the administration didn't have a clear red line it was actually willing to enforce. The third moment is the one that matters most, because it came at a point where nearly every outside analyst assumed action was not just likely, but imminent. Intelligence assessments had reportedly hardened. Allied governments had reportedly aligned behind a coordinated response. And still, publicly, the administration paused again, citing a final diplomatic window, one more attempt at a negotiated off-ramp before anything irreversible happened. By this point, the narrative in a lot of media coverage had fully solidified. This was an administration that talked tough, but consistently found reasons not to act, 3 separate times, on 3 separate occasions, when action seemed not just justified, but expected. And then, without the kind of extended public buildup that preceded the previous near misses, American forces struck Iranian infrastructure directly. Here's where most coverage of this story gets it wrong. The instinct, especially in fast-moving news cycles, is to treat these 4 moments as disconnected events, 3 separate decisions to hold back, followed by 1 separate decision to strike, almost as if the 4th decision happened independently of the first 3. That's not how decisions like this actually get made inside a government facing a situation this complex. Those 3 moments of restraint weren't hesitation in the way they were often portrayed. They were something closer to a deliberate sequence, each one serving a specific strategic function that only becomes clear once you see how the 4th moment actually unfolded. Let's break down what each pause was actually doing, because once you see the mechanics, the entire sequence starts to look less like indecision and more like preparation. The first pause bought something that's easy to overlook, but genuinely critical in a situation like this: time to build an accurate intelligence picture. Striking infrastructure isn't like striking a mobile military asset. Infrastructure targets are fixed, heavily defended, and often deeply layered, both physically and in terms of how much collateral damage a strike could cause if the targeting isn't precise. Rushing a strike on infrastructure based on incomplete intelligence risks either failing to achieve the strategic objective or causing damage that creates exactly the kind of humanitarian and diplomatic fallout that undermines the entire justification for acting in the first place. That first pause, whatever it looked like publicly, gave intelligence and military planners additional weeks to refine targeting data. confirm defensive capabilities around the sites in question, and model out the actual consequences of different strike options. The second pause did something different, and arguably even more important from a purely strategic standpoint. It bought coalition alignment. Modern military action, especially action as consequential as striking infrastructure inside a state actor's own territory, is rarely a purely unilateral American decision anymore, at least not one made without enormous diplomatic cost. Allies need to be consulted, not necessarily to grant permission, but because their cooperation, their basing access, their intelligence sharing, and their willingness to publicly stand behind the action afterward all matter enormously for how the strike is received internationally and how sustainable the aftermath becomes. A strike conducted without that alignment risks looking like reckless unilateralism, isolating the United States diplomatically at exactly the moment when broad international support matters most for managing whatever comes next. The second pause, read this way, wasn't drift. It was coalition building happening quietly, out of public view, while the public narrative focused entirely on the visible absence of action. Coalition building of this kind is rarely a simple, linear process, and it's worth understanding just how much friction typically exists behind the scenes, even among nominally aligned partners. Different allied governments bring different domestic political constraints, different intelligence assessments, and different levels of risk tolerance to conversations about supporting military action against another state's infrastructure. Some partners may be entirely willing to offer public support, but far more hesitant to provide the kind of operational access that would meaningfully increase their own exposure if retaliation followed. Others may be willing to provide quiet operational support while remaining publicly ambiguous, unwilling to be seen domestically as having endorsed the action outright. Reconciling those different postures into something resembling a coherent, coordinated position takes real time, real diplomatic capital, and often several rounds of high-level conversations that never become public at all. The second pause almost certainly reflects at least part of that grinding, unglamorous diplomatic work, a work that produces no dramatic headlines of its own, but which fundamentally shapes how sustainable and internationally defensible the eventual strike turns out to be. The third pause did something that's easy to dismiss as pure political theater, but which actually serves a very real strategic and legal function. It established, clearly and publicly, that diplomacy had been exhausted. This matters enormously, both for domestic political durability and for international legal justification. A government that strikes first and explains itself afterward faces a fundamentally different set of challenges than a government that can point to a documented, visible, good faith final attempt at a negotiated resolution before acting. That third pause, whatever else it accomplished, created a public record. It allowed officials afterward to point to a specific moment where one more diplomatic opportunity was offered and not meaningfully taken up, shifting the burden of escalation onto the other side of the negotiating table in the eyes of both domestic and international audiences. If you're starting to see how deliberately structured this sequence actually was, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part explains exactly what changed in that final window and why the strike came exactly when it did, rather than earlier or later. So what actually changed between the third pause and the moment the strike happened? Because understanding that gap is really understanding the entire decision. Part of the answer almost certainly involves the intelligence picture finally reaching a threshold of confidence that planners were comfortable acting on. Throughout the earlier pauses, officials had reportedly cited gaps in understanding exactly how defended certain infrastructure sites were, how quickly Iran could reconstitute capability if a strike only achieved partial damage, and how confident planners could be in avoiding the kind of civilian casualties that would completely overwhelm the strategic narrative around the strike. Those gaps don't close instantly. They close gradually through accumulated satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human intelligence sources, refined over weeks and months rather than days. It's entirely plausible that the specific timing of the strike reflects the moment when that intelligence picture finally crossed whatever internal threshold planners required before recommending action with real confidence. Part of the answer also almost certainly involves a shift in the calculated cost of continued restraint versus the calculated cost of action. Every additional pause carries its own risks that don't show up as dramatically in headlines as a strike does, but which accumulate steadily in the background. Continued restraint in the face of escalating provocation can embolden the other side, signaling that red lines aren't actually enforced, which in turn increases the likelihood of larger, more dangerous provocations down the road. It can also erode domestic political support for the administration's broader strategy, as critics increasingly frame repeated pauses as weakness rather than patience. And it can strain relationships with regional allies who are looking for reassurance that American commitments translate into action when circumstances actually require it. At some point in a sequence like this, the calculated cost of one, more pause starts to outweigh the calculated benefit of additional preparation time, and that's typically the moment when a strike that's been quietly prepared for months finally gets authorized. There's also a resource and readiness dimension to this timing question that rarely gets discussed publicly, but which almost certainly factored into when exactly this window opened. Positioning the specific military assets required for a precision infrastructure strike, submarines, carrier groups, refueling capacity, and the surveillance platforms needed to confirm real-time conditions on the ground isn't something that happens instantly. It requires weeks of logistical planning, much of which happens far from public view and generates little in the way of visible headlines. It's entirely plausible that part of what those three pauses were actually buying wasn't just intelligence confidence or coalition alignment in the abstract, but the physical positioning of the exact capabilities required to execute a strike of this precision and scale with minimal risk to American personnel and minimal chance of the kind of targeting failure that would undermine the entire operation's strategic purpose. Military logistics of this scale simply cannot be rushed without accepting meaningfully higher operational risk, and the administration weighing that trade-off carefully would have strong reasons to wait until assets were fully positioned rather than act on a compressed timeline driven primarily by political pressure to respond quickly. There's a psychological dimension to this pattern too, one that's worth taking seriously because it shapes how an adversary actually responds to a strike when it finally comes. A pattern, a visible restraint followed by decisive action, tends to have a very different psychological effect on an opposing government than a pattern of unpredictable, erratic escalation would. When a government has spent months appearing cautious, even hesitant, and then acts decisively, it sends a specific signal that the eventual action wasn't driven by impulsiveness or political pressure, but by a considered judgment that action had genuinely become necessary. That kind of signal tends to be taken more seriously by the targeted government's own internal decision makers than an action that appears reactive or emotionally driven, because it suggests a level of deliberate resolve that's harder to dismiss as temporary or reversible under pressure. In other words, the three pauses may have actually made the eventual strike more strategically effective, not less, precisely because they demonstrated restraint wasn't the same thing as an unwillingness to act when the moment genuinely called for it. There's a useful comparison here to how deterrence theory has long described the difference between a government whose threats are believed and a government whose threats are treated as bluster. A government that threatens action repeatedly without ever following through eventually trains its adversaries and its own allies to discount those threats almost entirely, regardless of how forceful the language becomes. Each unfulfilled warning erodes the credibility of the next one until threats stop functioning as deterrence at all and start functioning as background noise. The other side has learned to ignore. A government that instead demonstrates restraint precisely because it's building toward a genuinely credible action, rather than simply repeating threats it has no intention of carrying out, preserves something far more valuable over the long run. The sense that its eventual actions, however delayed, are actually connected to its stated positions. That distinction between empty repetition and deliberate preparation is often invisible in the moment and only becomes clear once the pattern resolves, which is exactly what happened here once the strike finally came. Now let's talk about the target itself, because striking infrastructure specifically, rather than purely military assets, represents a meaningful escalation in the kind of message being sent, and it's worth understanding exactly why that distinction matters so much strategically. Military targets, however significant, generally represent capability. In the moment, weapon systems, troop concentrations, command structures actively engaged in ongoing hostile activity. Striking those targets sends a message about immediate operational consequences for immediate operational behavior. Infrastructure is different. Infrastructure represents long-term capacity, the underlying systems that allow a state to sustain military activity, project economic power, and maintain the basic functioning of daily life for its population over months and years, not just in the current moment. Striking infrastructure sends a fundamentally different kind of message, not just that specific hostile actions will face consequences, but that the broader capacity enabling those actions, sustained over time, is itself now considered a legitimate and reachable target. That distinction matters enormously for how the targeted government interprets what's happened and how it calculates its own response options going forward. A strike on a military asset can often be absorbed and replaced relatively quickly, at least at a tactical level, without requiring a fundamental reassessment of overall strategy. A strike on infrastructure is much harder to simply absorb and move past because it touches systems that took years to build and that can't be quickly reconstituted, regardless of how much political will exists to do so. This is exactly why infrastructure strikes are typically treated as a much more serious escalation, both by the government being struck and by the international community watching the response unfold. And it's exactly why a decision to conduct one tends to go through such an extensive, multi-layered deliberation process before it's actually authorized. It's also worth understanding what infrastructure strikes communicate to third-party observers, not just to the government directly targeted. Other regional actors, some allied with Washington, some hostile, some officially neutral, are all watching how this specific sequence unfolds, because it functions as a live demonstration of what actually triggers decisive American action versus what doesn't. A government that only responds to direct military provocation with military target strikes sends one signal about its tolerance thresholds. A government willing to escalate to infrastructure targets after a sustained pattern of restraint sends a very different signal, one that potentially recalibrates how other regional actors, watching closely from the sidelines, calculate their own risk tolerance in future confrontations with American interests. This ripple effect, extending well beyond the immediate parties involved in this specific conflict, is often one of the most consequential and least discussed outcomes of a strike like this one, and it's a large part of why decisions of this magnitude get weighed so carefully before they're authorized. If this kind of honest breakdown of how these decisions actually get made is something you want more of, tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are tired of surface-level takes and actually want to understand the strategy underneath the headlines. Let's talk about how this decision actually reads from the inside of the country that got struck, because understanding Iran's internal reaction tells you a great deal about what happens next. For a government whose legitimacy depends heavily on projecting strength and control, both to its own population and to the network of regional allies and proxies it has spent decades cultivating, an infrastructure strike creates an immediate and unavoidable problem. It cannot simply be ignored or downplayed the way a smaller, more contained provocation might be. The scale and visibility of infrastructure damage makes it impossible to hide from the domestic population, many of whom will feel direct, tangible effects in the days and weeks that follow, whether through disrupted services, economic disruption, or simply the psychological impact of seeing a core national asset visibly damaged. This creates a genuine dilemma for leadership on the receiving end. Responding forcefully risks triggering exactly the kind of broader escalation that a strike of this scale was, in part, specifically designed to deter through demonstrated consequence. Not responding forcefully risks looking weak in front of the same internal audiences we've discussed in previous analyses, the hardline factions and security apparatus, whose continued loyalty depends heavily on perceptions of strength and resolve at the top. This is precisely the trap that a well-timed, well-executed infrastructure strike is designed to create. A situation where every available response option carries real costs, forcing leadership into a genuinely difficult, high-stakes calculation rather than allowing them a comfortable, low-cost path forward. This dilemma tends to play out in a fairly predictable sequence, one that's worth understanding because it helps explain the kind of mixed, sometimes contradictory signals that typically follow a strike of this magnitude. In the immediate aftermath, expect forceful public rhetoric, promises of retaliation, and demonstrations designed primarily for domestic consumption, rather than genuine military signaling. This initial phase serves the immediate need to reassure internal hardline audiences that the leadership hasn't simply absorbed the strike passively. What comes after that initial phase is far more revealing and far harder to predict in advance. It's in the weeks following the initial rhetorical response that the real internal debate plays out between factions favoring genuine, calculated retaliation and factions favoring a more measured, face-saving response that avoids triggering the kind of broader escalation neither side can fully control once it begins. Watching which of these two impulses ultimately wins out in the following weeks tells you far more about the actual trajectory of this conflict than the initial rhetoric ever will. It's worth noting here that the specific choice of infrastructure targets almost certainly wasn't arbitrary. Strategic planners typically select infrastructure targets based on a careful balance between sending a clear, unmistakable message and avoiding the kind of humanitarian catastrophe that would completely undermine international support for the action. This usually means prioritizing targets with clear military or dual-use significance, systems that support weapons production, command and control, or economic capacity directly tied to sustaining hostile activity, while avoiding purely civilian infrastructure whose destruction would offer little strategic value while generating enormous humanitarian and diplomatic backlash. The precision of that targeting decision, more than almost any other single factor, shapes how the strike is ultimately perceived internationally, whether it's framed as a proportionate, justified response to sustained provocation or as reckless escalation that crossed lines it shouldn't have crossed. Now let's step back and talk about why this three pauses then strike pattern matters so much beyond this single incident, because it reveals something important about how this administration appears to be approaching conflict decisions more broadly And it's a pattern worth watching for in future situations as well. There's a common assumption, especially in fast news cycles, that decisive action and visible restraint are somehow contradictory signals. That a government projecting patience and caution can't simultaneously be building toward decisive action, and that repeated pauses must necessarily indicate genuine indecision rather than deliberate preparation. This pattern suggests that assumption is often wrong, at least in situations involving highly consequential, high-stakes military decisions where the cost of acting too early with incomplete intelligence or insufficient coalition support can be just as damaging as the cost of acting too late. What this pattern actually suggests is a decision-making process built around accumulating conditions rather than reacting to individual provocations in isolation. Each pause wasn't a standalone decision to avoid action. Each pause was a checkpoint, an evaluation of whether the accumulated conditions, intelligence confidence, coalition alignment, and diplomatic exhaustion had reached the threshold required to justify action with real confidence in both the operational outcome and the broader strategic consequences. Only when all three conditions had genuinely been met did the pattern shift from restraint to action. And the shift, when it finally came, was decisive precisely because the preparation behind it had been so extensive. This has real implications for how observers, allies, and adversaries alike should interpret future moments of apparent restraint from this administration. The instinct to read pauses as weakness, as an unwillingness to follow through on stated positions, may consistently misread what's actually happening beneath the surface. It's entirely possible, based on this pattern, that apparent hesitation in future situations reflects the same kind of deliberate, multi-layered preparation process rather than genuine uncertainty about whether to act at all. That's not a comfortable read for adversaries, hoping that visible restraint signals an opening to escalate further without consequence. And it's not necessarily a comfortable read for allies either, who may find themselves needing to trust a process that, from the outside, often looks indistinguishable from genuine indecision right up until the moment it isn't. That trust requirement cuts both ways, and it's worth acknowledging the real strategic risk built into this approach. A pattern built around accumulating conditions before acting only remains effective as a deterrent if adversaries and allies alike eventually come to recognize and respect the pattern itself. If this sequence is read, even after the fact, as three genuine instances of hesitation followed by an unrelated fourth decision, rather than as a single connected strategy, much of the deterrent value gets lost regardless of how deliberate the actual internal process really was. Perception matters here almost as much as substance, which means the administration's ability to eventually shape the public narrative around this sequence, whether through official statements, background briefings, or simply the visible consistency of future decisions following a similar pattern, will significantly affect whether this approach actually functions as a repeatable deterrence strategy going forward, or whether it remains a one-time sequence that observers struggle to draw broader lessons from. There's also a domestic political dimension to this pattern worth acknowledging honestly, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum separate from public opinion and political pressure. Each of the three pauses drew real criticism from different directions, questioning the administration's resolve and consistency. That criticism is a real political cost, one that any administration considering repeated public restraint has to weigh carefully against the strategic benefits of additional preparation time. The fact that the pattern held, despite that mounting political pressure, 3 separate times, suggests a level of discipline in the decision-making process that's genuinely unusual, at least by the standards of how these situations typically play out in modern political environments, where the pressure to respond quickly and visibly to provocation is often intense and difficult to resist. Let's talk now about what happens next, because the strike itself, however significant, is really just the latest data point in an ongoing, unresolved situation. And there are a few key things worth watching closely in the days and weeks ahead. The first thing to watch is how Iran's leadership frames its own response publicly, because that framing will tell you a great deal about which internal faction currently holds more influence over the immediate reaction. A response framed primarily around retaliation and restored deterrence suggests hardline voices currently have the upper hand internally. A response framed more cautiously, emphasizing diplomatic paths forward, even while condemning the strike rhetorically, suggests more pragmatic voices may be managing to hold some influence over the immediate aftermath, even if that influence proves temporary. The second thing to watch is whether regional allies and partners publicly align behind the strike or distance themselves from it. The extent of that alignment, or lack of it, will significantly shape how sustainable this action proves to be over the following weeks, and whether it strengthens or strains the broader coalition relationships that the earlier pauses were, at least in part, specifically designed to protect and build. The third thing to watch is whether this strike proves to be an isolated, bounded action, or whether it marks the beginning of a broader, sustained campaign against additional infrastructure targets. The distinction between these two outcomes matters enormously, both for the immediate trajectory of the conflict and for how historians and analysts will eventually characterize this entire sequence, whether as a single, carefully calibrated demonstration of resolve, or as the opening move in a much longer, more sustained infrastructure campaign that this particular strike was simply the first visible step toward. Paragraph 2. The fourth thing worth watching, and one that's easy to overlook in the immediate aftermath of a strike like this, is how domestic political coverage inside the United States frames the sequence retroactively. Expect competing narratives to emerge almost immediately. One narrative will likely credit the pauses as evidence of careful, disciplined strategy that ultimately produced a more effective and better justified strike. A competing narrative will likely argue the pauses reflected genuine uncertainty, and that the eventual strike was reactive rather than the product of deliberate planning, essentially the same action that could have been taken with less risk had it come earlier. Neither narrative is likely to be fully provable in the short term because the internal deliberations that actually drove the timing of this decision are unlikely to become fully public for months or years, if ever. What's worth watching isn't which narrative eventually wins the public argument, but how each narrative gets used politically in the weeks ahead, particularly around any further decisions involving the same conflict. Paragraph 3. There's a broader lesson here too, one that extends well beyond this specific sequence of events. We tend to read government behavior, especially in fast-moving conflict situations, through a very narrow lens, treating each individual decision as a discrete, isolated event to be judged entirely on its own immediate merits. But decisions like this one are rarely made in isolation. They're built layer by layer through an accumulating process that often looks confusing or contradictory from the outside, precisely because the full logic connecting each individual step only becomes visible in hindsight once the final decisive action reveals what all the earlier apparent hesitation was actually building toward. That's an uncomfortable thing to sit with, because it means that in the moment it's often genuinely difficult, even for well-informed observers, to distinguish between a government that's building deliberately toward decisive action and a government that's simply drifting without a clear strategy at all. Both can look remarkably similar from the outside, right up until the moment the pattern either resolves into decisive action or continues drifting without one. The strike on Iranian infrastructure in this case resolved the ambiguity. But it's worth remembering that outcome wasn't inevitable or obvious in advance, and a different set of accumulated conditions could just as easily have produced a continued pattern of restraint instead. This ambiguity is exactly what makes situations like this one so difficult to cover responsibly in real time, and it's worth being honest about that difficulty rather than pretending hindsight analysis is somehow available while events are still unfolding. In the moment, reasonable observers genuinely disagreed about what each pause meant, and there was no reliable way to distinguish from publicly available information alone between a government carefully building toward action and a government that had simply lost the political will to follow through on its own stated positions. That uncertainty isn't a failure of analysis. It's an accurate reflection of how little outside observers can actually know about internal deliberations happening behind closed doors, regardless of how confident any single analyst's take might have sounded at the time. The only thing that ultimately resolved that uncertainty was the strike itself. And even now, the full internal story behind exactly how and when the final decision was made likely won't be publicly known for years, if it ever fully is. There's also a moral dimension worth acknowledging honestly here, because it's easy to reduce all of this down to strategy and timing, and forget the real human stakes underneath every one of these decisions. Every pause carried real risk, the risk that continued restraint could embolden further provocation, potentially costing lives that a faster response might have protected. And the eventual strike carried its own real risks and real costs, the risk of civilian harm, the risk of triggering exactly the kind of broader regional escalation that the entire preceding sequence of pauses was in part designed to avoid. There isn't a clean, comfortable answer to whether this specific sequence, 3 pauses followed by decisive action, represents the right approach or simply one approach among several imperfect options, each carrying its own serious risks and consequences. Anyone who claims certainty about that question is probably oversimplifying something genuinely difficult. It's worth sitting with the fact that both paths, action and restraint, carry casualties that are real but often invisible to outside observers in different ways. Restraint's cost shows up in provocations that go unanswered, in a slow erosion of deterrence that only becomes visible much later, sometimes only in hindsight after a larger crisis has already unfolded. Action's cost shows up More immediately and more visibly, in damaged infrastructure and disrupted lives, in the genuine uncertainty about how far retaliation might eventually spiral. Neither cost is hypothetical. Both are real. In any honest accounting of a decision like this, one has to hold both of those realities simultaneously, rather than treating one as an obvious, costless alternative to the other. This is precisely why decisions of this magnitude take as long as they do to reach, and why the 3 pauses, however frustrating they may have looked from the outside in the moment, likely reflected genuine, difficult deliberation rather than simple avoidance. What we can say with real confidence is this: the pattern of 3 pauses, followed by a decisive strike, wasn't the contradiction it initially appeared to be. It was a sequence, each stage serving a distinct strategic function, building toward a moment of action that came exactly when the accumulated conditions, intelligence confidence, coalition alignment, and diplomatic exhaustion, finally aligned. Reading restraint as weakness in this case would have meant missing the actual strategy unfolding underneath the surface the entire time. And reading the eventual strike as an isolated sudden reversal would mean missing just how much deliberate preparation had actually gone into that single decisive moment. Whether this pattern holds in future situations, whether it represents a genuinely consistent approach to conflict decision-making, or simply the specific circumstances of this one sequence, is something only time and future events will reveal. But it's a pattern worth remembering the next time a period of visible restraint looks, from the outside, like hesitation or drift. Sometimes it is exactly that. But sometimes, as this sequence demonstrated, it's something else entirely. Patience with a purpose, quietly building toward a moment the public won't fully understand until it's already happened. If this video helped you actually understand the real strategy behind a story that most headlines reduce to a single dramatic moment, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, share this with someone who's tired of the 30-second version of complicated decisions, and I'll see you in the next one, where we go even deeper into the strategy quietly shaping the decisions defining this conflict.